my MA.
Sorry.
My MA supervisor, John Reed, and my PhD supervisor, Gail Campbell. With that, I'll start. Lots of you likely know about the connection of women's war work to suffrage. And it's not something that I put a lot of emphasis on, and that's why I'm arranging this talk around some less known highlights of the women's suffrage movement. And you'll see that I'm going to put suffrage on a much longer continuum than some of you may be familiar with. In fact, I want to start quite early. I want to start, these are the 6 highlights I'm going to talk about tonight. You'll see the first one is 1843. That's, so I'm going to talk about these 6 highlights briefly, each of them. And as Greg said, I'm aiming for half an hour. So I'm looking at the clock to remind myself. So the first highlight I want to talk about is that in 1843, New Brunswick women lost the vote. Now, it's not a simple story, but we know that New Brunswick's first requirements for voting in their first election in 1795 had these 4, as you see on the slide, well, these 3 requirements, property, age, and residency in New Brunswick for 6 months. There was no gender requirement in 1795. So we don't exactly know if that's because the politicians assumed no woman would dare vote, or if it really was because property holding was considered the main requirement. I can't tell you how many women voted in this early era, but we know that some did, and we know that through the times when their votes were contested, because these were the days before the secret ballot. The secret ballot only came into effect in New Brunswick in the 1870s. So what could happen in a recount, and there were recounts in the past as much as there are today, what could happen in a recount is that the losing candidate might question some of the voters' qualifications. And that happened in New Brunswick, and it happened that some losing politicians questioned whether women should vote. What would happen in these cases is the sheriff would look at everyone who'd voted, do a report, and then the report would go to the House of Assembly, and the House of Assembly would determine whether the voters should be disqualified. We've got 2 examples in New Brunswick where women voters were disqualified. We don't know how many cases went through, but I can tell you a couple of cases. There were 44 Kings County women who voted in 1827 and 39 in Sudbury County in 1839. There's no details available on the Sudbury women, but the Kings County women voted almost equally for the winner and for the second place candidate. All the women who attempted to vote were single.
Okay, we'll look for it in a few minutes. I'm eating you a grilled cheese sandwich right now.
And met the land and age requirements. Presumably, these women thought that their property. We also know that this loophole was closed in 1843. That's why I want to start in 1843. The loophole was closed, and at that time, there was legislation that specified male voters. Male voters would vote the members of the assembly. So from that moment in 1843, we don't know that there was any even any challenge to this. As far as we know, it seems that it was just forgotten for about 4 decades, whether women really did have the right to vote at all. But whatever the case, I wanted to mention that women did vote in these early days. So that brings me to my second highlight, and that's the first time that a women's suffrage bill was raised in the New Brunswick legislature. It was raised in 1885. It was part of a bigger bill that was expanding the vote to men beyond landholders. So it gave the vote it proposed to give the vote to men who were land tenants, to farmers' sons who presumably just couldn't have land of their own in order to keep operating the farm, to occupiers of land, and fourthly, to propertied single women. These were the same women who had voted earlier, by the way. Well, the Premier proposed this bill, and the argument was that propertied single women should be included because they pay taxes. And anyone who pays taxes should have a right to choose their representative. Of course, taxation without representation had in fact been the cause of the American Revolution. So that was considered quite backward. So that's the rationale for giving propertied single women representation through the vote. Married women, in theory, didn't need it because married women were, in theory, represented by their husbands at the poll. I just have to mention, my parents are watching tonight, and my experience growing up was that they used to cancel each other out quite often at the polls. So I can't say that that's true, that we could have counted on husbands ever to represent wives at the poll. But back to 1885. There was some opposition, but the debate about this legislative bill had more support than not. And if you see what I have in red on the slide, this bill passed in the House of Assembly 20-6. It passed. It was pretty smooth sailing. However, it still needed to get through the upper house, the Legislative Assembly, and there it didn't do so well because the issue was raised in the upper house that with universal male suffrage coming along, there was a concern if women were included in the vote now, then maybe all, that is propertied single women, then maybe all women would get the vote soon. And that was way too much of a risk that that most politicians were willing to take. So I just have, this is the same slide with one line added. The Legislative Council vetoed that 1885 bill, worrying that all women would vote. They were only willing to consider propertied single women. And in fact, Premier Blair, he was really upset by this possibility. He accepted the Legislative Council's veto, and he actually became the province's biggest anti-suffragist. He was that for decades. He became the biggest obstacle. It so concerned him that this almost happened. It's worth a pause here to say that if the Legislative Assembly had passed or affirmed the Assembly's passing of the bill, if it had gone through the second house as expected, New Brunswick would have been miles ahead of most jurisdictions. I've got some dates here of the earliest countries to grant women the vote. You'll see New Zealand is the first in 1893, and New Brunswick's House of Assembly passed it in 1885. It really was close. And it's fun to think about what ifs, but as historians, we're not really supposed to do that very much. So I had to mention the what if, but it was kind of a big what if. That brings me to my third highlight of the New Brunswick women's suffrage movement. And what I've chosen for that third highlight is 1890s activism. The 1890s were the most intense decade of the suffrage agitation. It's mostly associated with two groups: the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in the 1870s, and Women's Enfranchisement Association, founded in 1894. These two groups worked tirelessly in New Brunswick, especially in the 1890s. The Women's Christian Temperance Union were an international group. that founded several branches in New Brunswick in the mid-1870s. The Saint John group was the region's only enfranchisement association. So the photo, sorry, yeah, it is a photo on the left is Grace Hathaway. She's probably the most famous member of the Saint John Women's Enfranchisement Association. And you'll know, the Saint Johners will know her because of the Frank and Grace, sorry, that's not Grace Hathaway, that's the daughter's name. It's Ella Hathaway, the Frank and Ella Hathaway Labor Pavilion. This is the same Hathaway. And on the right, you'll see an example of a Women's Christian Temperance Union poster. And it makes the point that women as mothers deserve the vote. And it would even go so far to say women would be better voters than men because women weren't susceptible to corruption. They were more pure. So these two groups, as I said, they worked tirelessly in the 1890s in particular. The WCTU, their initial goal, of course, was to eradicate the liquor problem. And rum in New Brunswick was huge with the timber trade in particular. But their failure to get prohibition implemented led the WCTU to fight for women's votes as a strategy, in part as a strategy for women to bring in prohibition. They said men would never do the right thing and vote for prohibition, so we needed women to vote because they would do the right thing. They established a franchise department in 1891. 1896, the national organization also endorsed suffrage. They were quite early, the WCTU, in endorsing suffrage in New Brunswick. The earliest was in Eastern New Brunswick in 1888. 9 petitions that year they presented to the government, 9 petitions for women's suffrage. And that's the petitions were one of the main efforts at suffrage, presenting the government with petitions, sometimes with thousands of names on them. In 1891, they hosted the National Convention of the WCTU. That is, Saint John hosted the National Convention. And that was the convention where they moved away from arguments about women's ballots more for home protection and toward more for equal rights. That now they started to say women deserve the vote as citizens. So this is an evolution within the WCTU of why women deserve the vote. They had a petition with 20,000 supporters at that convention. And a Fredericton woman, here's an example of a petition, but I'm admitting I did this quickly. I thought I should show you a photo or a picture of a petition, and I could only quickly find one from Nova Scotia, but it would have looked the same in New Brunswick. So I was talking about the petition from 1891 from the National Convention. And here's a quotation that said, the rights of citizenship can't be abridged or denied on account of sex. The average woman equals the average man. This is the WCTU. The other group I would like to mention, I'll go back to this slide, is the Saint John Women's Enfranchisement Association, the only Atlantic Canadian long-standing suffrage association. As I said, the WCTU had some efforts, significant efforts for suffrage, but the Saint John Women's Enfranchisement Association was the only specifically suffrage one. Nova Scotia, PEI, Newfoundland didn't have one, only one in the region, and quite impressive. 56 women signed up in the first month that the WEA was founded, and they were a really interesting group. Some members were upper class women, such as Grace Hathaway, women who had connections to the business and political elite of New Brunswick, but a roughly equal number of women in the first members, a roughly equal number were not the usual suffragists. They were not middle-class women, but they were motivated by their own personal experiences of gender-based discrimination. There were quite a few stenographers and some teachers. So in addition to organizing suffrage petitions, the Saint John WEA discussed women's right to pay, the equal to men's. I mean, this is quite something in the 1890s. And they even said that women's work in the home was equal in importance to men's wage earning work outside the home. Like, they were way ahead of their time. They also familiarized themselves with issues of taxation and property law locally and broadly, including through the writings of the 18th century economist Adam Smith. They advocated for fundamental changes to social structures and a shift toward gender equality. For their second annual public meeting, they invited high-profile American suffragette Julia Ward Howe to speak. I know I'm supposed to be talking about the 1890s, but I'll just mention also that in 1912, they hosted the British suffragette Sylvia Pankhurst. So these two famous suffragists, one from Britain and one from the US, they both visited Saint John. They didn't visit any other Atlantic Canadian cities. I think it's because of all the credit should go to the Saint John Women's Enfranchisement Association. My next highlight, my fourth highlight, more than halfway through, this is another grouping. This highlight is a grouping of the 9 bills, well, the first 8 that were brought to the New Brunswick legislature and debated. So I guess it's not a big spoiler alert. 1919, that bill finally passes, but all the other ones were long debates. And many of them were close, and some of them were even, well, the only one that was won was the one I already told you about in 1885. So I'm often asked, why did it take so long, given the support for suffrage? Why did it take so long? And I think my theory is that the closer it came, the more fierce the opposition became. I think the opposition, the anti-suffrage people, didn't really think in the early days that it was ever possible, but that 1885 bill scared the opponents. And I think that after that, it became more fierce and a much harder fight. The vote in 1889 was 21-14, not a washout. Several votes in the 90s, as you can see, 95, 99, supported by the petitions and lobbying of the WCTU and the the Saint John Women's Enfranchisement Association. But the antis had a very successful technique, unfortunately, for the pro-suffrage people. The antis would raise another, like a counter motion to delay. And they'd say, there's not enough proof yet. We don't know that women really want the vote. You know, we might have thousands of names on petitions, but that's not everyone. Sometimes they would say, we really should have a referendum of every New Brunswicker of voting age. So they would then ask for they would raise this counter motion, ask for a delay of 3 months. And the thing is, the legislature only sat for 2 months of the year. So a delay of 3 months was the same as voting it down. So that happened over and over. I'll tell you, it's quite depressing to read the debates because it's the same old arguments that keep coming up. That I mentioned a couple of them. There was concern that if women voted, they'd be taken away from their childcare duties. Who would take care of the home? I mean, even before cars, it wouldn't have taken that long to vote. But if you read the legislative debates, you would have sworn women could either take care of their children or vote. That's how it was presented by the antis. After the 90s, There was a lull. The suffragists were pretty frustrated. And then they took up campaigning again in 1908. And over the following decade, they just kept trying. 1909, 1912, 1913. These all, as you know, they lost. One thing they had going for them, though, was that Ella Hathaway's husband had been elected to the legislature, Frank Hathaway, and he was a big suffrage supporter. So it was him who was putting forward several of these bills after 1908. Everyone involved thought that the 1917 bill would be the final one. There was a lot of momentum. It was introduced by a Saint John Liberal MLA, William Roberts. He reminded the representatives in 1917 that the 4 Western Canadian provinces had all granted women's suffrage by now, and England was close to doing so. The rector of Saint John's largest Anglican church, Reverend Cody, endorsed suffrage in his sermon the Sunday before the legislative vote, referring to the justice and equity of the principle of equal suffrage. So there was so much momentum and so many endorsements that suffragists really believed this was going to be the one in 1917. The WEA went beyond their usual efforts on a speaking tour throughout the province, including Newcastle, Chipman, Chatham, Perth, and Moncton. And then on the day of the vote, there were 8 delegations on the steps of the legislature. And I've got a picture of the legislature there, if you can imagine it, 8 delegations of women. And 19 branches of the WCTU gave their support to the bill. 25 affiliated societies of the local council of women, and a new group, the Moncton Lady School Teachers. They all endorsed it. Imagine all that hope. And you know what I'm going to say. As you know, that one didn't go through. That was probably the hardest. It was a shock to lose that one. The aunties used their usual argument that the women hadn't proven that they really wanted this. And they even said women had engaged in war efforts to help their families, not in order to get the vote. So the aunties won that one 24-15. So this 1917 one was demoralizing. Many suffragists replaced their usual determination with bitterness. They were very frustrated. So I'm going to go to my 5th for that 1919 election, where I've said it so many times, you well know, this was the one that finally passed. And you'll see I have this section at the bottom. This is where it's the significant wording that became law finally. And in fact, it was unanimous. Some members of the Women's Enfranchisement Association said that male politicians by 1919 had been shamed into giving the vote to women. So it was unanimous, and it struck out those words male person and inserted the words person, whether male or female, married or unmarried, and that gave most women in New Brunswick the vote. You'll see on the left side, it's also, it does specifically say here that it's deemed expedient that the electoral franchise be extended to women upon the same terms as men. So passed with some exceptions, as I said. There's mention of women's war work. Whether I really dislike that emphasis on women's war work when you consider what a long campaign it was. I'll just remind you of that. But it kind of gave a graceful exit to some of the really fierce anti-suffrage people, because they could say, well, now women deserve it because of their war work. I think that's what happened. There was opposition that remained, and one way we see it is that New Brunswick was the only province that didn't allow women to run for office at the same time that they could vote. So in fact, there's a 15-year lag in New Brunswick between women getting the vote, most women, and women being allowed to vote in 1934. Of course, the main exclusion, I've hinted at it, is that Indigenous men and women were excluded. They were excluded. The rationale was that women were fighting for the vote and that women would get the vote on the same terms as men. I just point out over here, I guess it won't, I can't show you on my mouse, but on the left side, it says the electoral franchise be extended to women on the same terms as men. Well, men, Indigenous men living on reserve didn't have the vote at that time. So therefore, for women to get the vote on the same terms as men meant Indigenous, both men and women, continued to be excluded. I'll just mention that there were other cases where Indigenous men could vote and Indigenous women couldn't, especially I'm thinking band elections. Indigenous women couldn't vote in band elections till 1951. But in this case, it was both Indigenous men and women. And that is the last highlight I'd like to refer to is 1963, when Indigenous men and women living on reserve finally got the provincial vote in New Brunswick. And the lead up to this is that, well, Indigenous people living on reserve were called status Indians, and they were disqualified from exercising the franchise because they were considered wards of the state and the federal government. If you think that sounds problematic, that's good, because it really, really, really was. The federal government only let Indigenous people on reserve vote if they gave up their status, which very, very few did. You may know that in World War I, Indigenous men fought, and in World War II, they also fought. They were enfranchised in World War II as members of the military. I'm not aware of any Indigenous women nurses who were enfranchised, but it could have happened. After the war, the racism in not allowing Indigenous people on reserve to vote was even more apparent. The provinces began to enfranchise Indigenous men and women, starting with British Columbia in 1949. New Brunswick tied with PEI as the 5th province to give Indigenous people the vote provincially. And that was after Canada's 1960s Bill of Rights, and that the Bill of Rights had a big emphasis on equal rights for all Canadians. So that was very significant. How could Indigenous people not have the vote if Canada has this Bill of Rights? So federally, Indigenous people got the vote. Indigenous people living on reserve got the vote in 1960. Provincially, it was scattered across the province. Nova Scotia, interestingly, had never excluded Indigenous people, but New Brunswick and PEI did. And I put on the screen here a screenshot of a Wolastoqey woman you might know from the Tobique Reserve, Sandra Lovelace Nicholas. She's an activist, a New Brunswick woman activist who fought against sexual discrimination in the 1876 Indian Act, through which Indigenous women lost their status and benefits such as on-reserve housing if they married non-Indigenous men. Lovelace herself was refused on-reserve housing by the Tobique Band Council and forced to live in a tent with her son without health care or access to other supports when her marriage dissolved in the 70s. I mention this because many Indigenous women in New Brunswick, they didn't actually consider the provincial vote that important compared to some other issues. So I just mentioned that. And it would be great to hear from Indigenous women about, to explain that even more. So that's my 6 highlights. I think I'm right on half an hour. I hope these highlights have convinced you that gaining women's suffrage in New Brunswick was a long and fractious process. I think it's important to understand how long the fight was, and that today political equality is still a dream. After most women got the vote in 1919, few women were accepted as politicians for a long time. I note actually that one bright spot is Elizabeth Weir, and I'm grateful that she's in the audience tonight. Elizabeth Weir, the first woman to lead a political party in New Brunswick. And today in New Brunswick, we have 3 women mayors. But overall, the process is slow. And just to remind you how slow it is, for 20 years after women got the vote, from 1967 to 1987, New Brunswick only elected 4 women to the New Brunswick legislature. This is very slow, a very slow process. So the book that I've written, and it's almost out, I hope it'll be out this summer, it's called We Shall Persist, because it's only persistence that wins women the vote in New Brunswick. And that even extends after women won the vote. It's only persistence that keeps women trying in politics. So I'll stop there, and I'm hoping you have questions.
Yeah, this is Greg. Thanks, Heidi. Great presentation. So Heidi, I'll just let you sort of moderate your own Q&A, if you don't mind. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, rather than me play traffic director. And if things go quiet, which I don't think they will, there's some chat comments as well, right? So please, if you have a question, you can raise your little green hand or whatever, and get the attention of our speaker.
Have I stopped screen sharing, Greg?
Yeah, we're getting a desktop. We're getting your desktop now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not mine.
Oh, someone else's desktop.
Yeah.
Well, reviewing Georgie Day's screen. It says on mine. So, Georgie, if you can hear us, we're reviewing your screen. I'm not sure she can hear us. I don't know if I can take that over.
I don't know how to do that.
Let's see. Anyway, why don't we this is a little off-putting, but we don't want to delay the Q&A. So why don't we just proceed with that, and we'll just try to worry about the other thing after. So I see a hand or two.
This is Evelyn. I had my hand up. My question, I've got a few of them, but I'll start with one of them. My question is, who presented these bills and resolutions?
Each bill was presented by an MLA, and I mean, only MLAs could present bills, and that's the irony in women fighting for the vote. It was very hard to get the vote when they didn't have the vote, so they had to depend on male politicians. It was always MLAs who presented the bills. I mean, women could present their petitions, but even for the petitions to be tabled in the legislature, a man had to do it, a politician had to do it. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm moderating. I forgot there from Dr. Spinney.
Sorry, I had to find the mute button. I was just curious about the position that the Saint John Women's Enfranchisement Association has, where they're saying that women's work in the home is just as important. And it seems really interesting to me that that's coming from an urban place when I've more often heard that argument on Western farm families. And I'm wondering if you could speak more about that urban connection.
Well, the suffrage associations are like the specifically suffrage organizations, like the Dominion Women's Enfranchisement Association. All those branches are urban, as far as I know. I think Western women were very effective in promoting their work on the farm, and as important and legitimate. And of course, in the West, women were fighting for dower right at this time. That is the right to keep a third of their property upon their husband's death, so that the male son didn't inherit everything. And in the Maritimes, there was dower law. So that's a bit technical. Urban areas were where there were more professional women and more formally educated women. So it is where we see the suffrage associations in, I think, the Maritimes, Ontario, and Quebec, maybe, and BC. I think less so in the West. I'm thinking of the famous five. Many of them were rural. You're right, Aaron. Yeah. I think that's all. Maybe there's someone else who could add to that. Yeah. Lisa Best has a question. Oh, it's not Lisa, it's William Gallant.
So I was wondering if in the first bill that let women vote, were Black women included in that bill, or were they excluded from that also?
Saint John excluded Black people from voting earlier than 1885. By 1885, Black people are not formally excluded anywhere in Atlantic Canada. But what you have to remember is, like, there was so much racism and a higher level of poverty among Black people, that would they actually show up at the polls? I think that Black people would be discouraged from showing up at the polls in many cases. We do know in Halifax of some Black women businessmen voting in municipal elections. But the quick answer is Black people were not excluded by the 1880s, though in some cases they were earlier. It's a good question. It's
Thank you.
more overt for Indigenous people. Their exclusion is very overt. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Heidi.
You're welcome. Evelyn, do you have a question?
Yes, I was just wondering about the role of Sophia Fisk-Skinner
Yeah.
at this time. Like, I know I've studied her a little bit, and she was
Yes.
quite active in the Enfranchisement Association.
She's really interesting, isn't she? She's the person who was, she was widowed at a very young age, wasn't she?
Yes, she was. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and she became a French teacher because she needed to support herself. I think she was widowed in her 20s. So yes, she's you may know more about her than I do. I've read about her from the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. She's one of the original, I think she was the president of the Saint John Women's Enfranchisement Association. Yeah, so she was one of the petitioners and one of the organizers who, along with Ella Hathaway, kept the Saint John Enfranchisement Association going. And it's a fascinating organization. And the minute books are in the New Brunswick Museum, and they're one of my favorite sources of suffrage.
Great. Yeah, I know she was also active in like factory inspections and things like that, sort of a
Right.
social
I remember that.
activist, conditions for the workers and things like that.
Yes, I remember that. And a lot of the suffragists were also in very involved in public health. And Mabel Peters, another member, was involved in the North American Playground movement. So most of the suffragists, were involved in multiple reform organizations. Yeah, thanks, Evelyn. John Reed.
Thanks very much, Heidi. Really enjoyed your talk, and I was wondering about the 1885 bill, and I mean it's quite remarkable, really, that that bill, you know, passed in the House of Assembly and came so close, therefore, to passage. So I guess my question, and there's one sort of more general part and one more specific part to it. The general part is I'm just wondering who was driving that remarkable level of support. And the more specific part would be that you mentioned in 1894, the Enfranchisement Association and the presence, at least partially within it, of women in these career paths, which are expanding for women at that time. And one surmises they might be relatively younger women. Was that part of the support in 1885 as well? Was there a sense that there's a kind of different constituency of women that's emerging?
Thank you. That's a great question. In 1885, the women's groups, like there aren't, besides the WCTU, and it's not really taken on its enfranchisement mandate. So in 1885, it's hard for us to tell which women are supporting it. I think that the main driving force in 1885 is politicians who consider themselves progressive and who are concerned they're concerned about single propertied women. They are not concerned about all women. And remember, some of them have unmarried or married sisters, and they're concerned about women's rights, and but more from the perspective of women like losing their wealth, like through to a man who's not, like, before strong married women's property laws, it could be self-interest on the politicians for keeping money and power in their own families and money and power among the wealthy. And that combined with, as I said, about politicians who considered themselves progressive and who were really against the idea of having women pay taxes but not be able to vote. That was considered backward. And if New Brunswick was a progressive at all province, they should allow single women paying taxes to vote. So I think the main approach to that question is these men weren't caring, these male politicians were the main driving forces, and they were more concerned, much more concerned about wealthy middle and upper class women than poor women. They couldn't have cared less about the vote for poor women. And then when you said in 1890, John, the second part of your question, the career paths of women, did you mean in 1894?
Well, that was what that was the context where you mentioned it, and I was just curious as whether perhaps in 1885 there were some elements of that were already exerting an influence, some of these women in these new career patterns.
I wish I knew more about that, but I really didn't see it. Like, it's when the groups emerge that we get the documentation, we get the newspaper articles about meetings and minute books, like I said. Before that, it's really hard to see, and maybe like Gail Campbell has examples in her book on New Brunswick women's diaries. She has examples of women voting and commenting on voting. For me, doing this research, a diary entry, that was a needle in a haystack, and I didn't have that. So I'm more connected to the institutional histories.
Thank you very much. It's really,
John,
really
can I
interesting.
ask, John, can I ask you if you noticed the woman on my book?
Yes, I did. And
Yes.
Grace Annie, right?
That's right, Grace Annie Lockhart, because I
yeah.
wanted to make the point, there's a lot in my book about women's rights more generally, and I wanted to make Grace Annie Lockhart, as far as I know, wasn't a suffragist, but she was the first woman graduate of Mount Allison, and of course the first woman to get a BA in the British Empire. So that's why and it was a good picture. So anyway, for those of you who don't know, John Reed is the expert in Mount Allison history and in Grace Annie Lockhart. So yeah.
Thank you.
Greg, I think you have a question.
I put a couple things in chat, and if you have time too, there's a couple of points from Tamara Kelly Beckett, but another thing's come up. It's more about your forthcoming book. Will you be looking at the municipal level where women were disenfranchised well into the 1940s and 50s? It seems to me that maybe Muriel McQueen Ferguson worked on that issue, at some point in her career, but I don't know the details. But I know, like, used to have that thing for, unless you were a stakeholder or a property owner and all, in Saint John, different cities, that even if you're a man, you couldn't vote, like, in the days of universal male suffrage otherwise. So will you be covering that in your book, or?
Yes, I cover the municipal, because the municipalities are usually the first place that women vote, but as you say, it's only propertied women. And there's a property requirement in Halifax into the 60s. Women and men still aren't voting in municipal elections in Halifax into the 60s. So yeah, that's something I could have mentioned today, but I do talk about municipal voting.
Yeah. And a quick one I'm going to squeeze in. What about school board elections? Because often they were a place to, but you mentioned it's kind of shocking that women couldn't run for provincial office till the 30s. Could they run for school board elections earlier than that?
It depended on the province, and even in some provinces, it depended rurally or in urban areas. So PEI allows women, has a law to allow women to be school trustees. I think in the 1880s, they're way ahead of the other provinces, but they don't actually appoint a woman until I think it's the 60s. It's the 50s or the 60s. So that's another tricky thing about women in the vote. Like, sometimes it's allowed, but it still takes the government to do the appointment, and they don't do it.
As the famous PEI painting shows, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I don't see any other hands up, Greg.
Well, there's some chat. You want me to read the chat connections or questions, or Tamara, do you want to raise them yourself?
Oh, I can get the chat here.
Okay. Yeah. She's got one at 7:44 p.m.
Okay. No, New Brunswick, there was never in any Atlantic province any significant protests. It's not like Britain or the US, where there was violence, especially in Britain. New Brunswick, it was, in comparison, it was mostly petitions, letters to the editor, meetings. There weren't I wouldn't say there were protests. I'm looking, Acadian responses. I'll go back up. So Don Wright asks if there was a regional breakdown of support and opposition to women's suffrage in the province. Yes, so the Acadian regions were usually the least supportive, and the Acadian politicians, and we associate that with the Catholic Church. And of course, in Quebec, the Catholic Church was very successful in holding off women's suffrage. But New Brunswick also has a fantastic case of a woman whose her name was Emily LeBlanc, and she wrote in the newspaper. I'm quite sure it was Evangeline. I know there were 2 Acadian newspapers, but she wrote in a satirical fashion about how women needed to show men how to vote because they were doing a really poor job of it. So that's like the most public example of an Acadian woman supporting suffrage, but the Acadian women didn't tend to belong to the WCTU. There were no Acadian women in the Saint John Women's Enfranchisement Association. So I think Acadian women were quieter. I think because of the Catholic Church's clear opposition, and maybe even New Brunswick being that close to Quebec, there may have been some influence.
And Deborah's got her hand up.
Oh, Deborah, go ahead. Oh, it's RBJ.
Yeah, Arby. Well, this, I don't know that this actually relates too much to your, well, it's related, but I noticed that when you had the slide up of the different places, you had countries where, you know, and tracking where women were, you know, fighting for the vote and the progress they'd made. And the thing that strikes me is, although it's not exactly analogous, is that in the United States, before, during the period when some of the Western regions were still territories, women had the vote as early as 1869.
Yes.
But they didn't have, but once they became states, of course, which was much later, they lost that vote even earlier. But I was just kind of, I could see the similarities between what you were describing, how, you know, would you say they had to persist? Because it just, it seems like, you know, a little bit of one step forward and 2 steps back.
Yeah.
It was just a sort of a, struck me when I saw that slide, that it was, there was some parallels, but again, I can't remember if you were only using places that were within the British Empire. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think Utah had the vote.
1870.
Yeah. Okay.
There were at least 4 of them that had them in the late 1960s.
And the New Brunswick newspapers commented on that.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and New Brunswick politicians would raise that. The pro-suffrage Utah has had the vote for 20 years.
Yeah.
Or something like that. So yeah, they were aware. I think Maritimers were very aware of US states. Yeah. Yeah. But as you said, it didn't stick. It's that what if history, but it still means something, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm looking at the chat. I can't walk and chew gum at the same time, it seems. Suffrage among, there's a question about suffrage among immigrant women. Again, the examples are much stronger in the West and in Ontario. There were, I guess, partly the Maritimes isn't big enough to have specifically like immigrant societies, immigrant suffrage groups. I haven't seen any cases of immigrant women in Atlantic Canada among prominent suffragists. I know that there were a lot of Americans though, like recent American immigrants or recent British immigrants. I can say that for sure. But I was just guessing from this question that you're talking about Eastern European women who were strong in the suffrage movement in the West. But if you are talking about American or British immigrants, there were lots of them. I think sometimes half of suffrage groups or local council of women groups were recent British suffragists, were recent British immigrants. And that's partly the era that we're talking about. Like the 1880s to the 1920s is a period of immigration, especially for British and Americans. Lots of back and forth. Were some Protestant denominations more supportive and more opposed? Yes, the Methodists, I've seen the Methodists be more. So the other thing that connects to religion is that some religions had women preachers very early, like the Maritime Baptists had women preachers very early. And so that kind of leadership is a connection for some people and a connection when they're making arguments for suffrage. I mean, another argument was that the Queen Victoria was a leader. So if she could lead, then surely everyday women could have the vote. So, I see, in addition to Utah, Wyoming was another state. Now, D Stubbs says that Chinese people were late getting the vote in Canada. Asian people, Japanese and Chinese, were excluded from the vote in British Columbia until 1949, but they were not excluded in any Atlantic Canadian province. It's only Indigenous women excluded in New Brunswick and PEI. And now, Greg, we're out of questions in the chat. I think I've caught up.
I did have one about, again, I haven't gone looking, but it seems to me that not a lot of work's been done on this subject for New Brunswick. And so I mean, we those of us of a certain age might remember the book from the 50s, right, or the 40s or whatever on the Canadian suffrage movement. Of course, there's been a whole host of work done, other parts of Canada. So if there is a bit of a gap, if I'm correct, I'm not sure I am, but any ideas as to why, if there is a gap in the literature on this?
There's a huge gap. So yeah, that book by Catherine Cleverton is from 1949, and man, is she hard on the Maritimes. Oh yeah, and Elizabeth Mankey is reminding us about Colin Grittner's work, and he's got an article on the franchise that's really, I'm having trouble remembering the details, and I just know I was really impressed with it. So there's a gap. I don't know, like maybe sometimes when an aspect of history is covered, then some people think, okay, that part's done. But Catherine Cleverton didn't do a good job on the Maritimes. She made a lot of assumptions. She said basically that the Maritimes didn't have a suffrage movement. And she even groups the Maritimes with Quebec at some point, and it just doesn't go together. So, but she thinks that the West, and that the women in the West are amazing, and the women in the Maritimes and Atlantic Canada don't care about the vote, which is not true. Tamara asks if widowed women were considered single. Definitely. So it's single women means never married or widowed. Yeah, and so there were widowed women who had a lot of property, and the vote was considered a priority for them. and is it maybe that's Stephanie Pettigrew is mentioning that Gail Campbell did she's got a chapter in a book. And I'm blanking. Oh, it's Hannah. Yes, Gail Campbell wrote a book about the evolution of the franchise in New Brunswick, and she has a very nice section on women, and she brings it right up until I think it's 2005 when criminals, incarcerated people are given the vote in New Brunswick. So the vote changes in a lot of ways. It's not just about women, it's about age. In the 70s, I believe, the vote in New Brunswick, the provincial vote age requirement was reduced from 21 to 18. And I bet many of you have heard about the movements in some provinces, especially in BC, to decrease the voting age to 16. So anyway, Gail Campbell is an expert in that, in the evolution of the franchise in New Brunswick. Shelby has a question.
Hi. So you talked about when single propertied women almost got the right to vote early on. Did that happen in any of the other maritime provinces?
It happened in Nova Scotia a little bit later, and it was a really close vote. I think it was like 19 to 18, but they did win, or it was passed, but then it was again it was reversed in the Legislative Council. So same thing, and quite a panic among the anti-suffragists that it almost passed. Like they never dreamed it would happen, and it almost did. Yeah, so both New Brunswick and Nova Scotia came really close to passing it quite early. Yeah, thanks, Shelby. Erin, do you have another question?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back again to this urban context and talk. You mentioned teachers and how teachers are pushing for the vote. And I'm wondering if there are other trade unionists or like our typists banding together and pushing for suffrage, or clerical staff. I'm even curious about nurses, because I know that nurses are big pushers for suffrage in the UK as part of the Registration Act, which is going on in the 1890s. And I'm wondering if there are parallels happening in New Brunswick of these professional women who are in an urban context.
Well, you know, urban in New Brunswick is a lot different than urban in Britain. And I'm not saying it's not there, Erin, but I've never seen it. The closest would be in Newfoundland, where there were women's unions who, even if they didn't support suffrage, the leader of the union, Julia Salter Earl, she led a women's union, and she was a very strong promoter of the vote for women. And the union women themselves it's not as clear that they were behind her, but their leader was definitely. So yeah, we don't see it, Erin. We don't see groups or yeah, until quite late, the Moncton lady teachers. And we know that there were some teachers involved in there were lots of teachers involved in the WCTU. There were like women from every occupation were involved in the WCTU, but they never identified by occupation in suffrage activism.
Yeah, no, I find that really interesting. And I think it's indicative of this like fine line you have to walk when you can't like have the numbers to shadow your presence, right? If you go out and step on that line, you've stepped on the line and everybody knows it. Right, small
communities. Yeah, PEI is very interesting because there's virtually no visible suffrage agitation in PEI. They don't have any suffrage bills until the 1910s. And I believe the first suffrage bill they have passes because it's so late. And there I argue that it's an informal culture. There's an informal lobbying. You don't, yeah. So that New Brunswick compared to England could be a similar thing. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, Hannah's got the name of the book that Gail has an article in, Democratic Form in New Brunswick, edited by William Cross. Good. Gail's here, but being modest. Yeah. Greg, should we let people go after our long days of screen time these days?
Well, maybe.
Or am I projecting?
Well, maybe what we can do is we'll just we'll be like the auctioneer here or whatever, see if there's a final offer. If anyone would like to ask one final question, or a couple people would like to ask final. I know I have lots, but I don't want to monopolize our speakers' time and everyone else's time at a busy time of year. I can always contact Dr. MacDonald individually, right? So, so does anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak, would you like to ask a question or make a comment? Heidi, can you remind us of the publisher, if you know that, or do you?
Yep, it's UBC Press.
Okay.
Hoping it'll be out like late summer next fall.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
we'll I watched those academic catalogs, and we can of course the academics will track this down, but for other people we can post it on the New Brunswick Historical Society website too. But yeah, UBC puts out a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, it's part of a series. So the other volumes have been published, but I was the only person who had to do a book on 4 provinces.
Wow.
Yeah.
And one of those provinces is Newfoundland and Labrador.
That's right.
That
Yeah.
must have been challenging.
Well, it
Just the
was.
logistics.
Yeah, it's not Canadian.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and also just getting there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Greg, I'm really, really delighted that so many people came tonight. It's very generous of you, and it was really fun for me to talk about this. It's such a busy time of year, and we're so tired of screens. And I want to thank my parents for coming.
Yes, well, I want to thank you, and I want to echo your thoughts on the people signed up here. It's nice to have people from outside of the Saint John area attending these events. So again, we'll do more publicity in the new year. Actually, I think Erin Spinney I know she's speaking to us in February, and we will post the other speakers as Facebook events, and we'll do some media once we know those dates and those topics and speakers. That's great, folks. I think we'll probably call the virtual evening to an end, and enjoy the rest of your night, and stay safe, as we say. Okay. Thank you. Thanks again, Heidi MacDonald.
Thanks, everybody.